so it looks like we lost the connection reset or something or other. So where were we? That is most annoying. So what were we talking about? Oh, so right, so we've got our control node. Yeah, so if you can hear me, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Technabbit. Okay. Oh, streaming. So no wonder why Twitch is losing users. So where were we? All right, so this is why you have your control node, because your control node is the only thing that animates. Everything else just stays where it is. So depending on what it is that you're actually moving, you don't necessarily need to attach the catcher and pitcher node. Those, as discussed earlier, those are always, they can always be routed or parented to the root node. And because the root node must never, ever, ever be animated, they will stay where they are. Whereas everything else animates. But the keen amongst you may have noticed something. Because when using nodes, if I select one of the other nodes, there's no animation associated with them. Whoops. Now, if this were an armature, which is an object, a skeletal object that contains bones, you couldn't do this, or you would select an object and the animation would be assigned to the armature and it would be applicable to all the bones that were in the armature. But with nodes, we only need to animate a single node. Well, depending on the complexity of your animation, obviously. And this saves a lot of resources from the point of view of the complexity of the project and how it's set up, all of this stuff. Oh dear. The whole voice thing again. I'm sorry, Black Wolf, but I cannot allow you to do that. So we can now export this. So we want to select everything, right click the avatar mesh twice. Once, well, when we do this, I don't know if how clearly that comes out on screen, but if you do a big selection and you select everything in the scene, one of the objects will generally be a slightly paler color, and that's the active object. So we can use this to our advantage in the sense that if we want to deselect something, so if we want to deselect the dummy mesh, we have to first select it, so shift right click. That makes it the active object, so the outline changes color. And then we have to right click it again with shift held down again, and that will deselect it completely. What we then need to do is make one of the other objects the active element in the scene. So for this, it'll just be root, and that's fine. So we've selected everything, with root being the object of focus. So we can now export this. Export FBX. This is number 13, so that's fine. Selected objects. Disable use modifiers. Always disable add leaf bones. Animation, disable NLA strips and force start end keying. And what this does is it forces Blender to export the, if you have, so let's say there were multiple animations associated with this character, this furniture item. So it not only bobs up and down, but it jets around and does all sorts of loop-de-loops. Each one of those has to be a separate action, so which is why we need it to be in the action editor. That's a dope sheet, and then the action editor. The exporter needs to see an action, otherwise it'll create one, and that's if there is no action and the exporter creates one, that's where you can get problems occurring with your animations. So what the settings that we've just used do is if you have multiple animations, it'll force the exporter to export them as individual animated sequences. So selected, disable, 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 disable. 13, so that's okay. Export. So hopefully this will work and it won't break anything. Right, so I'm going to keep this where it is, and we're going to derive a new item. So furniture and rooms, furniture, and it's taking its time. Go. So that's the standard furniture. And so what we're going to do is import the FBX we just exported. So FBX import, load FBX, and we need to find the file, which is heartobike. Is that 12 or 13? Oh, there's 13. Lucky for some. Open. So we now have an animation that's been brought in. Why is it 298 frames? Is it 298 frames? It's 240. Oh, I know why. Okay, so right, so if you're in the USA, you might not need to do this, but if you're in Europe, the default in Europe is I think it's PAL, P-A-L, and that's 24 frames a second. So the extrapolation of 24 frames a second at 240, a sequence that's 240 frames long at 24 frames a second, IMVU looks to be thinking that that is 298 frames long for whatever reason. So we need to set this to 30 frames a second. And that'll speed up the animation a little bit. So export that again. Export. Selected. As disabled. That's okay, that's okay. Export. IMVU. Cancel that. So do that again. Load FBX. 13. Hopefully. There we go, 239. Oh, whoops. And we included the mesh. Funnily enough, actually, so the mesh, the dummy mesh, was included with the export. And because we've exported using FBX, it's brought everything in, but what we can do is just deselect them because we don't need them. And that's automatically deselected all the associated materials. Deselect rename bones, don't need that. Change the scale to 0.01 for Blender. Whoops. Yes, I mean, if you do, Liana's just saying that she set the FPS to 30 frames for, if it's a static pose, you don't need to do it because the static pose is just a single, although you have to do it. We went through this on yesterday's stream when we were creating the custom pose for the heartobike. If it's a static pose, it doesn't really matter too much the frame rate, but if it's an animated pose, it'll make a difference. So yes, it's best just to reset it so that it's 30. But for looped animations, it doesn't matter too much because the animation just loops and it'll just play back that loop. But if your animation, if you want it to look realistic, so if you are, like the avatar is currently moving, the avatar is animating at 30 frames a second. If it was animating at 24 frames a second, it would look slightly slow as it moved between poses. And although you can adjust that within IMVU's action editor, which we'll look at in a minute, it's best to try and set your animation up so that it's 30 frames a second to start with. Right, so we've deselected that mesh. We need to, mesh ID is 0. It's brought in our heartobike. That's fine. Handlebars, exhaust, heartobike. 012, and then import. So that's the material warnings. That's okay. Import changes. Apply changes. So we need a reference point, so load in the widget. So if you weren't here before, if you want this orientation widget, just message JazzCat on IMVU and I'll gift it to you. Instead of buying votes with trillions of credits, buying your votes with a widget. So what we can do now, whoops. So we've got our furniture node, that's fine. So check the mesh settings. Right, so we're going to add the action to the furniture item. So add, and this, so got a couple of things that we can do with this. So let's just do stance.idle for now. So this is the trigger. This is when this item loads into the room, it'll start playing this. Room, because it's a furniture item. A rooms applies to furniture and rooms, obviously. Same ensemble, and then in the ensembles we should have our, and we do, there it is, there's our animation. Want to set it up to replace, and we can loop it 0 times, which is infinite, and then we set up the keyframe. Oh, no, we don't need to do that for this actually. So apply changes, and there we have our slowly bobbing heartobike. And because we have the widget on screen, in fact, actually, if you want the widget, just say yes in the chat, and I'll gift it to you in IMVU. So just message your IMVU name, well, some of you might be cunningly disguised as someone else. But we also... Oh, he sent a message. Brilliant. Okay. Right, so look out for the widget coming to cinema near you soon. So we need to set up the pose now, because what we've actually done here is created two actions. One action is the bike bobbing up and down, and the other action is going to be the pose. So we need to import the pose. FBX import, load FBX, and this one was called heartobike pose 6. And again, make sure that you select the option with 86 bones. Yes, we are all disguised as someone else, Liana. Cunningly disguised. So 86 bones. Don't need to deselect that, that's fine. So we don't need any of this, which is the mesh stuff, so deselect. We don't need any of the materials, so deselect that. All we want is the heartobike pelvis node pose, which is 20 frames long. Make sure your apply scale is 0.01, so it should match the object that you've imported. Yes, I do. I do know who you are. Import. And that imports the pose, and it kind of messes up the... Oh, it didn't do it that time. Excellent. Oh, so sometimes what it does is it kind of messes up the furniture animation. So action. So we need to create another action. So add, and this is it start? Let me just double check. What did I do yesterday? Right, so it is stance. So stance dot heartobike. So that's the trigger word. This applies to the avatar. Same ensemble. Select the animation, which is the pelvis node one. Replace. Want this to loop infinitely. Frames 2 to 8. Apply change. And there we have our simple animation with the heartobike bobbing up and down. Save as. So there we are, an animated furniture item. So that didn't take too long, actually. So if you had multiple poses or multiple animations for the object, you'd have several action sequences, and each action sequence would relate to a particular animated XAF file. So what we can do, we can change how the animation triggers. Now I have to double check my references here. Where's the tutorial? because normally you can set your trigger to be a word. So let's say Bob. Apply changes, and this should, it won't do anything now until, whoops, until you type a trigger word which activates the animation. So that's approach 1, which is a trigger, a manual trigger. Approach 2 is to trigger the item as soon as it loads into the room, so the animation plays immediately. But there's a third way, and I have to reference the tutorial for this because I don't use it that often. Blah blah blah, where is it? There are a lot of tutorials in the Creator Education Center and on Catsbits. I think it's that one. Nope, it's not that one. And it's not that one. Unless it's one of the ones that are being published at the moment. I think it's one of the ones that are... Yeah, it's possibly one of the ones that are being published right now. So that will appear does anyone in chat know what it is? It's something like is it stance? I don't think it's stance. Stance heartobike, which is the node name, and then seat 01. I'm not sure that's correct. But what this does... Oh, it's that. Right, okay, so that's the third way, which is you activate the animation when the avatar sits on the node. Yes, it'll do that depending on... so Liana's just saying that the avatar animation will... It'll sometimes misfire, which is as expected behavior. But... Yes, so there are 3 ways of doing this. So the third way is to activate an animation when the avatar sits on the seating. And the way that you do that is to add your stance dot and then whatever the node name is, the seat node. So that's not that one, not that one, but that one. So that's the seat node that controls where the avatar is positioned, and for a custom pose that's always going to be a custom name that's associated with that. So in this instance we've got seat 01 because there's only one seat, seat 01 dot heartobike. So that's our custom node which overrides the defaults. So you include that as your stance dot heartobike. So that tells IMVU that the stance trigger or the stance element of that trigger tells IMVU that this should activate as soon as the spot is used. So this is a little bit like stance.idle. But in order for it to know what the seat node is, to know that it is a seat node, I should say, you add dash seat, in this instance it's 01, so seat 01, or whatever number the seat node is. And that will automatically trigger the animation when the seat node's used. So we've got a manual trigger, and that'll just trigger regardless. That's a manual trigger. We've got stance.idle. This is our automatic trigger. As soon as the item loads, it will play the animation. And then we've got stance.heartobike hyphen seat, in this instance 01. And that activates as soon as the spot is used. So that's 3 different ways of triggering a furniture animation. And it's the same for rooms as well. So that's animated furniture item. So if there are any questions about what we've just been doing, ask away. Oh, was that the cat typing the plus sign? That's funny. Showing its approval. Could have been a minus sign or a negative. I've been told that cats do, yes, so I couldn't agree more with the cat. I know what we can do. So that's basically completed this particular item. So we've created the heart, added textures, UV maps, exported those as UVs, and then created some simple textures. Created a pose, got that exported, got everything set up, and then added an animation, simple animation, to the furniture item, which is what we've just done. So let's just save that. What is that? That's save that.